Buenos días.
Good morning. Welcome everyone to the second International Symposium Intervention Strategies for the Recovery of the Cultural Heritage Damaged by the 2017 earthquakes. We are very happy thanks to the activity calendar we have put together, thanks to the collaboration we have had with the Ministry of Culture, the European Union, and obviously the National Institute of Anthropology and History. I would like to thank the authorities of the European Union, the National Institute of Anthropology and History, and the Ministry of Culture for their support in these 2 days. I am personally deeply thankful to all the European experts that have gathered today in this symposium. And we are deeply thankful and honored for you taking the time to prepare these presentations, as well as for taking time to do field visits and collaborate with us in an issue that is so relevant for the preservation of our cultural heritage. Thank you to all the experts that will be giving presentations today, as well as to the attendants that have gathered today at the auditorium of the National Preservation, Restoration and Museography School. Thank you also to the organizing committee. So we will first start with our first round of conferences with a small presentation by the national coordinators of cultural heritage preservation and historical monument preservation. So I would like to start with the bio of Valeria Valero and María Carmen Castro Barrera. Mrs. Valero majored in architecture from the National Autonomous University of Mexico and specialized in architecture in Italy. As part of her career in the National Institute of Anthropology, she has been a technical support expert in the preservation of historical monuments and historical buildings. She has also been the Deputy Director of External Interventions. She has coordinated several interventions both in Mexico and the world. She has collaborated as well in interventions of contemporary and historical buildings in countries like Peru, Belize, and the United States. She is a scholar at the school that we are at the National School for the Preservation, Restoration, and Museography of Mexico, and she has also been the national coordinator of museum building preservation projects. María del Carmen Castro Barrera majored in the fixed asset preservation interventions at INAH, and since 2004 she is an expert preserver, and she has also been the Director of Preservation Strategies between 2005 and 2016. She has been a preserver of the National Anthropology Museum, as well as the Museum of Tlatelolco, and many other preservation projects. She is an expert in the application of nanotechnology, and she participated in the Nano for Art exhibit in the National Anthropology Museum. She also received an award for her intervention strategies to damaged belts, and she has also supervised the master's and doctoral thesis in terms of cultural heritage protection and preservation. I would like to thank both of them because they have been remarkably involved in the organization of this event. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for these kind opening remarks. Welcome everyone. Good morning to all of you. And like Amintali has said, it is a pleasure for the National Institute of Anthropology and History to be with you. First, I would like to thank all of you for your presence in this second International Symposium. And I would like to thank again our European experts who came all the way from Europe to participate in this event. Many of you were here for the first symposium. You were here to share your experiences and your viewpoints about cultural heritage preservation. And we hope that those of you who are new will also share your experiences. So thank you and welcome all. Like Talia said, María, Carmen and myself will give a briefer presentation of the topic that is of most interest to us right now. We will describe what we have done since the past year when we had the first symposium. The 2017 earthquakes, as well as the February 2018 earthquake, considerably damaged Mexican cultural heritage. 2,000 federal cultural heritage sites, mostly religious, and nearly 15,000 assets that were not for religious purposes were damaged by these events. As a result, during 2018, the Ministry of Culture, as well as the National Institute of Anthropology and History, intensified their preservation tasks with the support of various countries to recover the cultural heritage that had been damaged by the 2017 earthquakes. The first symposium was the result of the solidarity of the European Union within the framework of the European Cultural Heritage Year. Thanks to this event, we have been able to strengthen our cooperation in terms of cultural heritage preservation between the European Union and Mexico. This event has been deeply enriching in terms of learning how to preserve our cultural heritage when a major natural catastrophe occurs. This is a very strong tool to build bridges between countries and communities. The topics of the first symposium were the technical criteria for the intervention and the recovery of damaged cultural assets, technical guidelines for the restoration of fixed and movable assets, and last but not least, strategic planning as well as social integration for the recovery of damaged cultural assets. In November 2018, in fact, just a year ago, we gathered in the Temple of San Juan Bautista in Tlayacapan, Morelos, with the objective of our European experts to measure the magnitude of the damages left by the 2017 earthquakes. In the following days, we had a keynote speeches delivered by European experts as well as by Mexican expert conservators who discussed specific topics. Some of the most relevant general conclusions of the first international symposium were the following. In spite of the resistance faced at different levels of government, cultural public policies should be cross-cutting in order to have an impact at different levels of government and society, because the recovery of our cultural heritage should be mainstreamed at all levels of government. We also discussed the importance of making some regulations more flexible to understand applicable regulations as well as preservation theories, so that regulations do not obstruct and degrade our preservation efforts. We underscored the importance of interdisciplinary work in defining guidelines that ensure permanent dialogue between conservators, architects, as well as the users of the damaged fixed assets, both in terms of intervention as well as their preservation. During the discussion sessions about the technical criteria, we concluded that collapsed buildings should be treated in a special way, given that they are essential to the collective memory of Mexican society. These interventions should also take place with prior notice to the local communities. The assets should also be considered within the framework of their social and cultural context before an intervention is decided upon. Decisions about interventions should also take into consideration their historical background as well as prior natural phenomena. The information about the intervention should be shared through open databases, since this is essential for the proper maintenance of the Mexican cultural heritage. These efforts will continue to be implemented in the upcoming years. Bringing together all the stakeholders as well as deciding on all the technical interventions should be available to everyone so that they can be used as a data pool for future interventions. Currently, we are unable to draw on previous available information since we have not created an instrument of this sort. The actions that will lead, or the first steps towards these large-scale interventions include the stabilization of the damaged projects. We also need to have interventions that are strongly related to society. Now, when answering the question about what the relationship between experts and society is, we found that there should be a close link between the two, so that we are properly able to process social expectations. Cultural heritage recovery requires generalized social empowerment and should ensure the sustainability of a collective urban space or a cultural heritage site that belongs to society. That is why society is essential in the decision-making process. We also decided to create interdisciplinary seminars to discuss the intervention experience. And finally, cultural heritage preservance in Mexico, as well as the European Union, decided to work on particular lines of action, such as having these information exchange events as an essential aspect to intervention and preservation. As a result, 2 years after the 2017 earthquakes, we have been able to give an interdisciplinary approach to the recovery of our cultural heritage, but there have also been lessons that we need to learn from. So, in conclusion, we were able to create a very valuable discussion laboratory to discuss the social, cultural, technical, and legal, and even administrative challenges to events of this sort to ensure effective direct intervention. The impact of the European Union's participation will be large-scale, and that is why the National Institute of Anthropology and History, as well as the Ministry of Culture, have restated their support to this cooperation mechanism, and that is also one of the reasons why we have created the second International Symposium to further the efforts of the European Union in terms of cultural heritage recovery. And that is why we are all here today to start our second International Symposium. And I will now give the floor to María Carmen, who will finish with the introduction of this second International Symposium. Thank you. Thank you very much, Valeria. Welcome, everyone. It is a pleasure for Valeria and myself to organize this second International Symposium. I was not an organizer or during the first symposium. I was only a participant, but I could see all the effort that gathered around the symposium itself, and how I got to see the organization from the other side. I am very thankful for having been able to participate with the support of the European Union, as well as all the rest of the relevant stakeholders in this sense, both the National Institute of Anthropology, as well as the National Coordination of Historical Monuments and the National Coordination for the Preservation of the Mexican Cultural Heritage. We wanted to have a second edition of this event because we wanted to build on the findings and the outcomes of the first International Symposium, and we wanted to address a little further the challenges of the first symposium. The symposium is divided into three. We had the first series of activities yesterday with a field visit. And the sites we visited are Nepocualco and Totoloapan, both in the state of Morelos, and we had the support of both conservators as well as historical experts. We also had the support of Victor Hugo Valencia and the National Institute of Anthropology and History. In order to give way to our conferences and the participation of our fellow European and Mexican experts, I would like to go over our agenda for today so that we know who will be participating and what they will be talking about. First, we have Margarita Segarra Lagunes, Francesco Cellini, and Giovanni Cangi. Both of them have already participated in preservation projects in Mexico. Two of them have already been finished, and one of them is a work in progress. One of these projects is the project Intertela del Volcán. Some of you might be familiar with it. And another one is Zahualpan and Hualupita in Amecameca. We also have participants from Hungary who are experts, Sok Basaros and Oliver Kovac. They have participated with the National Coordination of Historical Monuments in structural analysis efforts. And they are currently working in Tepoztlán and in the Sagrado Corazón de Jesús Church in the Roma neighborhood in Mexico City that was also affected by the 2017 earthquakes. We also have Santiago Huerta, Francisco Jurado from Spain. Santiago Huerta is mostly known for his considerable experience in construction, as well as his expertise in the recovery of cupolas, as well as other religious sites. Francisco Jurado is also an expert in construction, and Leonardo Sanchez Mesa will discuss issues related to management. María Elena Corrado is someone that I am really happy to host because she is an expert in terms of risk management and effective planning. And this is particularly important given our vulnerability to earthquakes. We also have Stefano Gardocci and Matteo Chivaliari, who have performed surveys on collapsed sites. And in terms of fixed assets, we were really concerned about how to recover damaged fixed structures such as mosaics. We have Walter Murk, who has supported us in the recovery of glass windows. We have Frances Lop-Vivallo, who is our expert in bells. He has already supported us in this. And we have Mauricio Angelillo, who is also an expert in his field and will be sharing his expertise with us. We will also talk about the recovery of organs. José Luis Acevedo and Norma Peña will be in charge of this conference, and they have done a great effort in recovering organs in states that were mostly affected by earthquakes. We also have Antonio Mondragón, Mariana López, and they will be talking on behalf of the National Coordination of Historical Monuments. We have more experts, of course, but I would like to describe right now the third stage of this event. And during these discussion sessions, we will talk about the Nonualco and Totoloapan projects. We will also talk about Nuestra Señora de Loreto, or Our Lady of Loreto, Our Lady of Los Angeles, and we will also talk about the recovery project in the Metropolitan Cathedral. So all of this is meant to address an issue that has been of great concern to us as restorers. After this symposium, we will work on the recommendations that our fellow experts made during the first symposium. So I will now give the floor to Santiago Huerta so that he talks to us about the recovery of historical structures. Thank you.
Pues vamos a empezar con la conferencia. Y para ello,
we'll start with the first. Huerta is an architect graduated in 1981 from the Technical Architecture School in Madrid, Spain. He studied structure calculation and he obtained his PhD in 1990, and he received an award from the Politécnica of Madrid University. This past 20 years he has been a consultant for historical buildings. He has worked in the structural analysis from
as part of Madrid's Superior School, and he's part of a history, construction history, and he has wrote 80 publications on books. In 2011, he received the Delford Gold Medal from the British Association of Civil Engineers. Santiago Huerta will be introducing the study of historical structures towards a new paradigm, merging traditional and modern context. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to start by thanking you for the invitation to this symposium. Perhaps the most noticeable aspect of old structures is that they have remained intact through the path of time, natural disasters, wars, and they remain to date. Now, the second extraordinary aspect is that in spite of it, and nowadays we look at them and we are fearful of them. Today I'll be discussing both issues, and I'll try to explain both the strength and the robust aspect of this historic masonry, and I'll also share with you my own theory regarding the current lack of trust, the antipathy before these technical models. I see this in architects and many more that work in restoration. Since we are talking about historical monuments, we can relate to history. History always places everything where it needs to be. And now, quoting a German philosopher, Julius Hartger, if you know the old, you'll understand the new. Allow me to start with the historic overview, showing some sites that have remained in place to date. This is a drawing of Vitruvio. It's a German drawing, and there are two materials that are wood and masonry. We're talking about wood, bricks, and mortars. Before permanent settlements, other type of provisional constructions were built, and funnily enough, in some parts of this planet, they remain in construction. The first permanent settlements appear, and they were built with masonry, with land, with bricks. The brick was created 8,000 years ago. Clay mixed with sand, with straw, and this is a technique that is still used in Africa, for instance. Now, walls are covered with wood roofs, and 6,000 years ago, the arch or the vault was created. We don't know exactly where it took place. It may have been in Egypt, Minor Asia, Mesopotamia, and this has a 5,000 years as a tomb. Now, this is a technique that uses bricks, and it's still used in the northern of Africa. 2,000 years afterwards, before Christ, these vaults, they were mainly building tombs, but they emerged from the subsoil, they multiplied slides, they moved from 1 meter to 1.5 meters to 5 meters, and they create In Egypt, some silos that remain to date. Babylonia, of course, made a systematic use of arch, vaults. In Babylon, they also used bricks. They used pebbles. Next came the Romans, and they used new material. It was cement made by small pebbles. So they first built pristine walls, and in the Empire era they multiplied light by 5. So instead of 5 meters, they became 25 meters, and some of these vaults remain in place. Nothing is eternal, not even Roman cement. And in the 18th century, the temple still used that dome. The Roman Pantheon is 2,000 years old. It's still in place. It has not been abandoned, but it has not received a structural redo. Siphon, we're talking about 3 or 4 century after Christ, and it has survived earthquakes and Iraq's war. Santa Sofia, 6th century in Constantinople, built by Isidoro de Mileto. We have Justinian as an architect. Architects were actually these two that I've mentioned. They were mechanicals. That was the highest degree that the architects were given, since they were not only working with architecture, but they were familiar with gravity and Archimedes' volume calculations. And not only Saint Sophia, but any tourist that goes through Istanbul sees many buildings that are over 1,000 years old and they remain in place. We have Saint Irene, and it's a wonderful building. These buildings were built not only to resist static but also earthquakes. This drawing shows they eliminated the 33-meter dome, and it is the semi-dome that allowed the building to remain on site and resist earthquakes. Now this dome didn't fell, so 3/4 of its dome may remain well. This is a 1999 earthquake image in Turkey, and it is a destruction landscape of modern buildings. This is an old mosque intact. And following this historical overview, we see vaults in Córdoba. This is the Villaviciosa Chapel. And in the east, domes made out of these are the basis of the Gothic times, and these cathedrals are in balance. They nowadays represent some fear to modern architects. It's not only a miracle for them to remain in place, but we need to think that throughout the whole construction process, they remained in place, standing. This may be the oldest image that shows Alfonso X, and it is a fascinating subject. Gothic construction has been written by many authors. We see St. Peter from Rome. It's
linterna pesa 1.500 toneladas, el tambor pesa 10.000 toneladas, la cúpula se cerró en 2 años, y eso supone poner en obra 50
centering
toneladas al día. Es decir, trabajaban día y noche,
weighs 10
subiendo,
tons.
los ladrillos en caballerías.
The dome weighs 10 tons. It all weighs
San Pablo, el gran
50
invento de Christopher
tons.
Wren, una
Same
cúpula fantástica,
Pablo,
que,
it
bueno,
is
pues,
a
cabe
magnificent
dentro de esa
dome
red.
that fits
Otra
within St.
característica de las
Peter.
mamposterías es que manejan
Another feature
innumerables
of
tamaños
masonry
y
is that
podemos
it
formar
can
una
be
matriosca
used
poniendo
by
un
different
edificio dentro de otro.
sizes, so we can place
En
a
el
building
barroco,
within
pues,
another
sigue la
building.
construcción de cúpulas,
In
que también están en pie. Y
In
esto
the
es,
Baroque,
digamos, al final de la
domes
tradición.
were
Esto
still
es
used,
mediados del
and
siglo XIX, un maestro de
mid-19th
obra,
century,
un arquitecto en
this
Malta,
was built not even
construye
by
esta
an
cúpula en
architect,
Malta,
a
basándose evidentemente
worker
en el
built,
Panteón
built
y con
this
casi
dome
40
in
metros de
Malta with almost 40 meters in
Bien.
lighting.
los puentes.
Now,
También, durante
bridges.
siglos, desde la época
For
de los
centuries,
romanos, se han construido
before
puentes,
Romans,
y debo
bridges
decir
have
aquí
been
una
built,
anécdota. En la
and
ciudad de
let me share with
Salamanca,
you an
yo he visto
anecdote.
hace
In
unos
Salamanca, I
un
saw
letrero,
a
estaba el
couple of
puente
decades
romano
ago
y
a
el puente nuevo.
notice, and it
Y
said
había un letrero que
Roman
ponía,
Bridge
"El
and
tráfico
New
pesado
Bridge,
por el
and
puente
a
romano".
notice said heavy traffic through the Roman
En el
Bridge.
siglo XIX, esta tradición
In the 19th
milenaria,
century, this is a millenary
empieza
tradition,
a sufrir la competencia de lo
and
que se llaman los nuevos
they started
los
suffering. No,
nuevos materiales.
in the
La
late
producción
18th
industrial del
century,
hierro fundido
the industrial
permitió
production
hacer
of
puentes
melted
más ligeros.
iron
Este es el
allowed the
Corpus
construction
Dei,
of
que
lighter
existe
bridges.
en
This
Inglaterra.
remains still in place.
Y
It
se hicieron
exists
también
in
los primeros
England,
pórticos en
and the
hierro fundido.
first
Es decir, hacían falta nuevos
melted
equipos edificatorios.
iron
Efectivamente, el hierro empezó a competir en edificaciones industriales.
porticos were
Estos
created.
proyectos
This
no fueron
iron
ni de
was used
arquitectos
in
ni de ingenieros, eran los
industrial projects,
fundidores,
and
los
it
que se
was
dieron cuenta de
used
las
and created
posibilidades
by
del hierro.
melters, not by architects. They were the ones who
Cuando
noticed iron properties.
En 1800
In
se presenta el concurso para
1800s
sustituir
at
el
Telford,
antiguo puente de
Telford
Londres, presenta este proyecto,
attended a
un
competition
arco
in order to
de
build
casi 200
an
metros de
arch.
luz
This is
en
an
hierro
almost
fundido.
200 lighting
Expresión ahí
arch
del
made
acero,
out
del
of
material,
melted iron.
Este es uno de los puentes y construidos
This is
de
one of the
Telford,
bridges,
todavía en pie de
Telford
hierro fundido.
bridges of
El hierro
melted
fundido es un material
iron.
frágil,
Melted
no
iron
resiste bien
is
las tracciones,
fragile,
como
and it
mampostería.
doesn't
Es bueno
resist
para
as well
arcos
as
y para
masonry.
pilares,
It's well
pero las
for
vigas
arches
a
and
veces
pillars,
fallan.
but
El
beams
último gran
sometimes
edificio de hierro fundido es
aren't
el
the
Palacio
best.
Cristal de
The
Londres,
last building is the
que duró,
London
hasta el
Glass
incendio que lo destruyó en los
Palace
años
that
30.
lasted until the 30s due
El
to a
hierro
fire.
forjado.
Now,
Laminado en
forged
forma de perfiles
iron,
permite
it
formar
has a shape
celdas,
of
armaduras,
profiles, and it
estaciones.
allows to create spaces.
Y entonces en la segunda mitad
And in
del
the
siglo
second
XIX,
half of the
el
19th
hierro
century,
forjado que permite
forged
trabajar a
iron
tracción y a compresión,
allows to
uniones
work
que
in
soportan tracción y
traction
compresión, permite
and
hacer cosas
compression,
como la Torre
and
Eiffel. En la Exposición Universal de París de
it
1889,
allowed
el
the
tema era el
creation
triunfo del
of
hierro,
the Eiffel
pues se
Tower.
construye la Torre
Iron
Eiffel, y en
was
esta imagen
a
se
synonym
compara
of
la
triumph,
Torre Eiffel
and here we are
con
comparing the
la pirámide de
Eiffel
Keops,
Tower with the Cheops
la Burja de
Pyramid,
Estrasburgo, San Pedro
the
de Roma,
Strasbourg
y una
Needle,
serie de
St. Peter in Rome, as well as
Es
other
evidente que los
buildings.
ingenieros, que fueron los que
Evidently,
proyectaron los
engineers,
edificios,
the ones
tenían
who
un
had projections of
orgullo
these
y
buildings,
querían
were
demostrar la
proud about
supremacía
it,
del
and they
nuevo
wanted to
material.
show
Los
this
arquitectos
new
seguían a lo
material.
suyo. Es decir, no
Architects
se
remained
consideraba
in
que
their
el hierro fuera
own
un material
field.
para
They
hacer
didn't
edificios
believe iron to
representativos.
be a very
Esto
representative
en
and beneficial
1889,
material.
en 1900 los
Now,
proyectos los
in
hacen los arquitectos.
1900s,
Y hacen
projects
esto.
were done by
Pues,
architects,
en
and
fin.
this is what they did.
¿Cómo se sostiene esto? Pues se sostiene con
And
estructuras como
how
las de la Torre Eiffel.
is this sustained? Well,
Efectivamente, la
just as
arquitectura
structures
moderna
as the
estaba
Eiffel
dentro
Tower.
de esa
Modern
última
architecture was
arquitectura
within this
ecléctica ya,
last
que prácticamente había
eclectic
perdido el rumbo.
architecture that
Algunos
had
arquitectos
lost its
todavía
way.
siguieron apostando
Some
por la
architects
mampostería.
still
Rafael Guastavino,
bet
en
for
América,
masonry. Rafael
se llevó la técnica
Guastavino
tradicional,
in
que la
America
aprendió en
took this
Valencia,
technique,
que luego
learned
perfeccionó
in Valencia,
en
and he
Barcelona,
perfected
se
it
la llevó a
in
América
Barcelona.
y
Then he
demuestra a los
took it
arquitectos americanos que se pueden hacer
to America, and he
cúpulas
showed
colgando,
that
como
domes
las hacían
can be
ellos,
built not
de las armaduras de
hanging
madera,
them
sino cúpulas
from
que trabajaran
wooden
de verdad como
frames, but
Esta es la imagen de
they
la
could
Castro
work
House
as
en Nueva York,
a structure.
una cúpula oval de
We
40
see in New
metros,
York
de
this
mayor,
building,
27
it
tamaño,
has
cúpula oval,
a highest oval dome. It's a 30-meter dome. And after it is coated, we have the same image from the last part of the history. The Pennsylvania station is a recreation of Roman structures, but this is an iron structure. And these were Guastavino made vaults. He knew how to mix materials, iron, masonry, and others working in flexion. Now, the first quarter of the 20th century, masonry was still used. They used iron, but in the end, what they were looking for was a stoic structure. In the early 20th century, it was created in the 19th century, but we see the use of the use of cement. This was an eternal material. It was used for monolithic buildings. And in the Enevig published magazine, it was an advertising magazine sharing cement, and it displays pictures of his failure. He failed in Tunisia, and buildings were inclining in this way. So he said, well, if they can sustain these inclinations, they will resist even earthquakes. So towards the 1930s, cement was more used, coinciding with the modern architecture. In the 20s, they were using the Bauhaus, Le Corbusier. In Mexico, we see O'Gorman. Now, why is this related to masonry? It is not. It is not related to it. A Gothic cathedral is not a reinforced concrete portico or porch. It is different. It is a tradition. It is a tradition of masonry that was lost through the 20th century. Nowadays, theory and construction of masonry structures is not taught in engineering nor architecture schools. And as a professor, I am concerned about it. We hand degrees that signify that architects can work in this type of a building, but we don't devote not even half an hour of official credits in explaining how they were built and how they work. Now, this is not a homogeneous material, it's not elastic, it's not isotropous. We cannot define elasticity. We do not know how it is supported. It usually is cracked, and this feeling that constitutes 90% of this wall is usually masonry and its result from the previous demolition. The Roman church is within the Gothic that took place afterwards, and in Spain, within the Roman is the old mosque, and within these is the Sigaric church. This factory is a unilateral material. We say in an argot that it needs to work in compression, not in traction. These factories should transfer compression. The arch needs to have a certain shape so that compression forces can be within. It's not working in flexion, which is typical of 20th century reinforced concrete porches. Now, this is cracked, which is not bad. This is adaptable since it has that feature, that since it can crack. Terencio, Italian from the 30s, when he did the second to last restoration, since Valeria had the last restoring, he discovered these cracks. These are behind the surface, meaning that it is still present. So he reflected upon these cracks. He said it's not only that your hand fits in, your whole body could almost fit. These are 2,000-old cracks that happened when it was settled, and a 2,000 crack, we can say that it represents no danger. This church is in the northern part of Spain, in Galicia. It's a long story, but back then these were built and that's how they remained. It was initially a middle cannon, but now these have opened up, and this is not an exaggerated drawing, this is how it is. And we cannot explain it within elasticity theory, nor with a program on finite elements. Now, in Gothic structures, there are also cracks, but what happened? After the Second World War, reinforced concrete benefited from the 19th century masonry and from its wearing. So they said masonry is not good. But these are the buildings that have survived wars, earthquakes, floodings, but they don't work well. These are not made out of reinforced concrete. So what is it that engineers and architects do? They improve masonry. If it lasts 1,000 years, but they say that it is not good enough, then they decided to improve it. Therefore, part of this masonry was taken down, and they included reinforced concrete. This has been the usual practice from the 60s. It came from earlier times, and we're about to write the story about the reinforced concrete in masonry. This is within Santiago de Compostela. So these type of brackets that we need to adhere in buildings, it turns out that they are not damaging, and the trend keeps on its use. These vaults remain in place after the Aquila earthquake without any cracks, and this was the intervention. Placing a double mesh from a reinforced concrete, which will need to be placed with a spoon because it's a very small hole, and then it'll connect to the stone. Of course, this has been done out of a good will. We all want things to last forever, such as the reinforced concrete. But things don't last forever. We need to maintain them and not violating its nature. Reinforced concrete is almost a bomb. In Spain, we are now trying to remove reinforced concrete. In the case of towers in Santiago de Compostela Cathedral, we needed to demount the whole dome in order to remove a 40-centimeter reinforced concrete that's damaging the stone. And it's been less than 50 years from its use. Now, going back to the origin, this so-called fabrica is a material that has its own characteristics. It's the brick and mortar construction, and it is a millenary technique that we should know, just as these men knew it in the north of Africa. The brick and mortar construction is resistant, and it shows after the First World War bombing. Roger Gilman intended to deepen the Gothic studies, and yes, even though these were bombed intensively, cathedrals didn't fall. They didn't fail entirely. By the late 20th century, engineers decided that if it cannot be calculated in its elasticity, then it is not well done. In fact, stone bridges are calculated as if they were elastic. But I don't think that a stone bridge is elastic at all. Now, Benuville did a static study with equilibrium, and it shows the evidence. These that have supported almost 800 years, they are well mounted. Gothic masters knew their trade. In the 50s, Klaus Pieper, he was the engineer who reconstructed most of the structures in Lübeck. María and Kirche, it's very well formed. It has a 40 centimeters pillar, and he said he included this geometry, did some equilibrium calculations, and he reconstructed this church, including some reinforced concrete. Otherwise, they wouldn't listen. But it was very little. And what happened in the 60s and 70s? This idea that it all needs to be elastic, continuous, just as reinforced concrete, it was transferred to several engineers. Since there were no browsers, they used photoelastic methods, and it is impressive for anyone to believe that this is just the same as this other image. These buttresses are filled, they have filling, it's not even clay. But it doesn't stop there. Afterwards are finite elements, linear, non-linear. With information that is not of our knowledge, we need to say, is this elastic, homogeneous? And we need to know its frame conditions. We have people refining meshes, and well, these are the images that are in color originally. Now, what happens with structures and its theory? The 19th century is the elastic century, the elastic theory century. It is a fantastic element, and in the early 20th century, some engineers noticed that elasticity calculated by hand or by computer did not have anything to do with the real state of structures. John Baker in England, which is a long story, he developed the plastic theory. The plastic theory doesn't want to know tension on each point from finite elements, but rather getting to know the structure's resistance and its collapsed church. It was successfully used in steel porches. Now, Jacques Heyman from Cambridge, he's still alive and is one of the greatest theoreticals of the 20th century, and he noticed that this brick and mortar is also a plastic construction, meaning that brick and mortars include plasticity, they are cracked, and we are able to calculate its load capacity, but we are unable to know its tension. There's also a theory explained in plenty books written by Professor Heyman. Some have been translated to Spanish, and Professor Aloca and myself, we both believed it to be fundamental to have these books translated into Spanish, for people to have access to this basic theory. This is the right theory that allows us to understand and, in certain circumstances, intervene structures. We are now able to calculate the arch collapse load, and if we do calculations in the lab, we have a distribution. In England, before emulating a bridge, and if you get an essay, this is exactly same result.
teoría plástica se demuestran
Now,
tres
within the
teoremas.
plasticity theory, there are
El más
three
fundamental de los tres teoremas fundamentales es el teorema de la
aspects,
seguridad.
but the most important
El
one
teorema de la
is
seguridad dice, si es
safety
posible
theorem.
encontrar una
It
distribución de
says
fuerzas
if you're
internas
able to find an
en equilibrio con las
internal
cargas que no llevan la
strength
condición
of
de límite del material,
distribution,
la estructura no se hundirá.
the structure will not
Aplicado a los átomos. Una distribución de fuerzas
deteriorate
internas en equilibrio con las cargas
nor
es
plunge.
una línea de empujes, una curva de presiones.
So
La
this
condición del
is,
material es que tiene que trabajar a compresión.
the material needs
Si
to work
podemos
in
dibujar
compression. If
una
we
curva de
are
presiones en
able
la línea de
to
empujes
draw
de
a
un arco,
compression
el arco no se
curve
hundirá.
within this arch, then it
El
will
arco
not
se
collapse.
agrietará
It will be
para
cracked
determinados pequeños movimientos. De hecho, no
in
podemos
certain
saber el
movements,
estado
and
real
we
del
are
arco,
unable
pero sí
to know the
sabemos que el
real
arco no
arch
se hundirá.
state, but what we know is
Este
that
teorema
it will
fundamental
not
explica,
collapse.
de hecho,
This fundamental
lo que hemos
theorem explains what
Esa
we've
enorme
just seen.
resistencia,
It is
esa
that
seguridad que depende de las
resistance
geometrías y
and
las geometrías
safety
se
that
mantienen,
depends
la
upon
estructura
geometry.
se sostiene.
If geometry stays in place, then the structure will
Es lo
remain
que
in
explica
place,
que esta bóveda se haya
which
podido
explains
adaptar a ese
that this
movimiento
vault
extremo, no
was
caerse,
adapted and it
lo
did
que
not
explica que las
collapse,
grietas del
which comes to
Panteón
show
son
that Pantheon cracks
simplemente una
are
manera de adaptarse
simply
y es posible
just,
encontrar una solución de
it's
equilibrio
a way
en
in
una
which
estructura
they are
derrotada.
adapting a
Por
cracked
cierto,
structure.
Gerencio pensaba que las grietas eran
And
buenas.
by the way, Gerencio thought that
No está
cracks
publicado,
were
es un
good.
asunto que estoy
It is
estudiando,
not
pero en
published,
algunos
it's
escritos
part
muy
of my research, but in
inéditos,
some of
él
his
dice
writings,
que las grietas son
he
buenas, que la
says that
estructura de la
cracks
grieta
are
se acomoda
good.
mejor.
When a structure is cracked, then it
Las
has a
bóvedas de
better
crucería también se agrietan. Las
form
grietas es
and
una manera de
shape.
acomodarse
So
al
cracks
inevitable
allow
cedimiento de las
structures
cimentaciones
to
y consiguiente
position
movimiento de los
in
apoyos.
accordance to the
Estas
movement.
son las grietas que hemos visto
These are
antes,
the
y estas
cracks that
grietas,
we've seen
desde el punto de vista de
before,
la seguridad, son irrelevantes.
and for safety purposes, they are
Por supuesto,
irrelevant.
si aquí la mampostería estuviera dañada y se cae
If
una piedra,
masonry were damaged and a stone were to fall, then that'd be dangerous. But it happens in a roof. If a tile is not well placed, then
pues
it's
se puede
also
hacer daño.
a potential
Tampoco he sabido
damage.
esto, no entiendo por qué. Bueno, era un análisis gráfico
Well, this was a
consistente.
graphic analysis of
La
that
estática
bridge.
gráfica es,
The graphic
entonces,
static, therefore,
la estática
is.
gráfica fue considerada por los ingenieros
This
de finales del
was
siglo
considered
XIX como
by
algo
late 19th century engineers,
crudo, que lo usaban los arquitectos,
and it was
algunos
used by
arquitectos.
some
La estática
architects.
gráfica no es más que una manera de buscar
Graphic
una solución de
statics
equilibrio.
is a
Una de ellas.
search
Se puede buscar
for
una solución de equilibrio por
equilibrium.
ordenador, se puede
You
buscar una
may
solución de equilibrio
try
derivando
to
las
find
ecuaciones
equilibrium,
diferenciales,
including
de muchas
differential
maneras.
equations or through a computer. And
Buscaba
Gaudi,
modelos.
for instance, he was
En el caso
looking
de la
for
iglesia de la
models.
economía Güell,
In the case of the
una
church,
planta muy irregular,
from the
formó un
well,
modelo colgante de escala 1:20.
it was a
De esa
120
manera obtenía
scale,
formas, sabía que
and
la
he
forma
obtained
se
shapes.
movía al
He
cambiar
knew
las
that
cargas,
shapes would move when changing
como
loads,
decía, Collins,
and
el
as
modelo de
Collins
Gaudí fue
said,
una máquina de
Gaudi's
proyectar.
model was a projection machine.
Hemos dicho que efectivamente la estabilidad depende de la
Stability
geometría.
depends
Eso lo
upon
sabían los
geometry.
romanos,
We
y esto
said
está
so
sacado del
already.
libro de
Romans
Antonio
knew
Dufresne.
about it, Dufresne,
Efectivamente, la proporción del Panteón,
and the
esto es un
Pantheon
templo de cúmulo, que es
proportion, and this
prácticamente
is
la
a
mitad, pues
temple,
es la
it's
misma.
almost a half, but
Y
it's the same.
para una cúpula romana de
For a
una
Roman
cierta luz,
dome
pues
with
el
certain
espesor del
light,
tambor es aproximadamente un séptimo.
it
Y un
means
arqueólogo,
that
Jürgen Rasch, también estudiando numerosas cúpulas, ha encontrado este tipo
the
de
way is
proporción.
almost a
Usaban los romanos estas reglas,
1/7.
pues,
Romans
con toda
used
seguridad.
these rules with
Si hacemos un modelo de una iglesia gótica,
absolute
y no se cae.
certainty.
Un modelo hecho de piezas sueltas, claro.
We
Un
have
modelo de
made
madera o un modelo de
representations of the
plástico.
Gothic. This is a plastic
hacer una
model,
iglesia
not
que
a
no se
wooden
cae.
model, and we are
Si
able to build
hay una
a
iglesia
church and it
construida que
doesn't
no se ha
fall.
caído, podemos hacer una iglesia más grande que no se cae.
We have done a
Y eso
smaller
está
church
detrás de
and
las
it
reglas
remains
de
in place, and
proyecto
we're
que
able to do
existían,
an
que
even
se
larger church.
buscar en los tratados,
These
etcétera.
can be looked for in treaties.
Ellos buscaban una geometría correcta.
What they were looking for was a correct geometry.
A veces, claro, estas reglas
Obviously, these rules were for canon cases. There's also extraordinary cases such as the Cathedral of Palma Mayor. It has a lateral vault of 9 meters, and in this case it seems impossible. How could these very thin pillars that are twice lighter than usual, how would they be able to support the lateral structure? Well, Gothics knew that in order to have stability, you needed to load it. So this way on top of these pieces give equilibrium. And it was done by a Gaudí's student. So the vision from studying construction history and studying proportional rules from Gothic teachers, they say that cracks do not matter. From the Baroque, yes, there have been reports saying that cracks are potentially dangerous, but in the Gothic times, it seems that they were ordinary. And this quote from Viollet-le-Duc is almost poetic, but very lively regarding safety. The skeleton either remains in place or collapses. It follows needs and a location. It seems to be alive. It seems that it is obeying opposite forces, and stability is only acquired through these forces and their equilibrium. So, equilibrium and stability comes from masonry and also reinforced concrete and all the movement that happens right there. And it's part of these skeletal structures. Now, this is the first Bridges Treaty, and she is the architect. Bridges project was part of the architecture. We see a landscape of different bridges, and in the middle is a balance, which is the symbol for this equilibrium. We have a middle point arch that weighs more than the other one because it pushes further, and in Latin says upondera libra, meaning as its weight in the balance, it's just as it's built in architecture. So what's the current situation? We are concerned about masonry structures, but why is this? Well, because we are not familiar with them. Ignorance leads to fear, and fear usually leads to irrational actions. And there's also another component that we cannot leave aside. If we mix fear, ignorance, and profit, then we have a very dangerous cocktail. Ignorance and fear are tackled by means of knowledge. Knowledge leads to respect. By knowledge and respect, we may have a rational answer, proportioned and balanced answer. This is what we should seek for, going back to this tradition that was lost throughout the 20th century. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Te pediríamos que no te bajes todavía.
Thank you. If you could please remain with the microphone, we'd like to open up the floor for 2 questions. Excuse me? Yes, over there. Oscar Ibarra from Historic Monuments Coordination. I thank you for this quick talk and your very specific point on not knowing construction materials in these structures. This is fundamental for any type of intervention project. And as a result of earthquakes, from the reviews we've done, we noticed that these cracks are part of these structures. That's the structure showing its energy. It's the accumulated energy that a structure just has, and we shouldn't fear them. It is only about understanding their behavior. Could you please deepen on this example? When an earthquake takes place, such as the one that took place in 2017, I'm not an earthquake expert, but I work with those that are, such as Professor Angeli and Dr. Roberta Fonti. And the 2017 earthquake was very intense and it was long-lasting, which damages masonry. Yes, there were pieces that collapsed, and it is alarming. There were deceased people. It was a tragedy. Some buildings collapsed, but many more didn't. Meaning that in Mexico City, for instance, the Santa María de los Ángeles dome, it was cracked in half. But how many domes are there in Mexico City that remained intact? Yesterday, we visited the two buildings that were damaged the most, and they shared a common characteristic. They had been the first intervened with the use of reinforced concrete, and we don't really know how it was used. As part of the debate, it'd be good to document building state in order to evaluate the earthquake damages and the brick and mortar construction. A construction as the one that I showed has a 20 centimeters piece, another one, so, and 80% of this wall has mortar, lime, and land. However, if water has filtered in, obviously that mortar that used to be good enough then has vanished. It does not do its job anymore. So we need to be fair. We need to see what has happened, but also what was the building's situation. And we can compare buildings that have resisted as opposed to others that didn't. And that's why we are here today, in order to do so. There's another question over here. Thank you, Talia. Due to this lack of knowledge on how these buildings work, the ones that are built from masonry, and the knowledge regarding geometry and the structure's general behavior, back in the 60s, traditional materials were no longer used, such as lime, at least in Mexico. And what has been really positive has been going back to lime, its knowledge, and its qualities when it is combined with stones and stone-related material. So I think that this is adding to your comment, Santiago. Yes. With O'Gorman, for instance, it happened such as the reinforced concrete. We saw it and we still see it. The O'Gorman was seen as fantastic. It was a phenomenon. It was more resistant. It was a harder surface, but it has almost taken us 100 years to notice that in the previous 2,000 years, when lime mortar was used, they used it not because they were dumb. They were using a material that allows transpiration to happen. It's not very hard, meaning that its resistance may not be a quality, but leaving aside the tradition and the use of lime that has been used in Mexico and in Spain, very little people use it in Spain. It seems that non-using foreign elements, people very rarely use reinforced concrete in Spain, but now they use carbon fiber, for instance.
La mia non è una domanda, è solo una precisazione. Intanto mi scuso perché non parlo la vostra lingua e non so se ho capito bene, ma credo di aver visto un esempio, lei ci ha mostrato un esempio dell'Aquila, di una voltina estratossale in calcestruzzo. Volevo solamente dire che nella normativa italiana quel tipo di intervento è vietato, quindi non so qual è l'esempio, però ormai in Italia sono decenni che le voltine estratossali in calcestruzzo, soprattutto sugli edifici monumentali, non vengono assolutamente approvate. Era solo questo, quello magari è un esempio vero, non posso mettere in discussione, però la cultura italiana, perlomeno sul calcestruzzo, ormai sono decenni che ha comunque in qualche modo accertato e dichiarata l'incompatibilità, che poi in effetti andrebbe in qualche modo anche approfondito questo. Ah no, non so se mi capiscono. Chiedo scusa, io sono partito in quarta pensando.
Io non parlo l'italiano, però io ho capito l'italiano.
Chiedo scusa. Beh, era solo questo, una precisazione. Tutto qua.
Sí, yo creo. Sí, bueno, lo que ha dicho el profesor es que efectivamente la normativa italiana,
As he said, the Italian standard
del hormigón armado
does not allow for the use of reinforced concrete as we have seen in the image. We were in Aquila 2 years ago, and we visited this building, and that's what we noticed. The worst part of it is that there were no cracks in these beautiful brick-built vaults. So we see all three factors. The ignorance, meaning that a brick-built vault is not good, in a good condition. The fear, being fearful to the following earthquake. I mean, in this earthquake nothing has happened, but maybe the next one is worse. So it is an invasive response, destructive response, in including these reinforced concrete structure. And obviously for the construction company, the building was in good conditions. The only thing that they needed to do was call in painters. So these are the three factors that we cannot leave aside. It is a monetary speculation. I mean, there is a lot of money entailed. Many companies are interested, and they want to remain in these non-trusting environments, since that's where their profit comes from. We'd like to thank Professor Santiago.
Y le vamos a pedir, por favor,
now, Dr. Francis, if you could please join us in the floor. You can speak here in the podium or in the table. It's your call. In the meantime, I'll read his bio.
Francesco Pivaio graduated from the Architectural School of Madrid. He was a member of the Catalan Association of Architects for 28 years until his retirement. He is an expert in ethnology, as well as the chief of cultural heritage management, and he is also an expert in bells. For more than 50 years, he has studied the sound of bells and has documented these through audiovisual techniques. He coordinates campaigners.com, or he has coordinated campaigners.com for 23 years. And I would like to mention that Dr. Lop was here a couple of months ago, and he was in Oaxaca. So thank you very much for coming again. He will now give his presentation titled Bells and Earthquakes, Traditional Mexican Solutions. Thank you very much. While my presentation is displayed, I would like to thank the INAH as well as CNCPC for their generosity, and I feel like home here in Mexico. I've been here for 5 or 6 times, and I really miss it when I'm not here. We have been able to collaborate very well about bells and their preservation in Mexico. And speaking of knowledge sharing, during my bio, my collaborator mentioned campanas.com, and in campanas.com we have information about 214 bells around the world. And in order to preserve them, we need registries, because without registration, we cannot preserve our cultural heritage. Before speaking about bells in Mexico, we should talk about the symbol of bells. Bells are a fixed asset as well as a movable asset, and like we said yesterday, bells are sanctified to a certain extent, and they are even baptized. They are even given a name, and they are considered sacred. Their sound is considered sacred. And the bell, when it breaks, it is melted, and then another one is cast, as opposed to other historical objects that are stored away when they are broken. This is not the case with bells, and we need to think about this in depth. We have often said that bells are the voice of God, but they are also a deeper calling, and they do not only call to mass. Bells are the best instrument that communities can use to express their feelings. So what do I mean by this? If we are in celebration, if we are in times when protection and security are needed, the ringing of bells raises an alarm better than any SMS. Another important thing is that bells are like the string in a guitar. They are not the instrument itself. They are part of the larger instrument. So it is a resonance box. And they are the ones that show the direction of the road to follow. So, for example, a community that loses a bell is a castrated community, because they have been deprived of what symbolizes their community most. And in Totolapan, people said to me yesterday that they wanted to build even a bigger bell. Bells are the representation of a community, and the bells should ring strongly. And if we do not understand their importance to architecture, then we have not understood architecture at all. Bells should ring. They should emit sound. That is why some fake vaults are not meant for the bellmen that have fallen into oblivion to remain silent. Rather the opposite. The towers, the bell towers, are meant for the bell to sound as loud as possible. And these are also a sign that our community is here, and this spurs self-reflection. It is also essential for other communities to know what our bell ringing style is. Last year we recommended that some bells were brought down, and many of them have already done it. For technical purposes, the bells had to be brought down because the towers were half collapsed. But they also have a healing effect in communities. Yesterday in Totolapan, I was able to record the calling to Mass. That is very different from anything else I had heard in the world. I have recorded the sound of more than 500 bells, and I am always surprised by new bell ringings. And this is a symbol of why bells are so relevant to our cultural heritage. And that is why either we document them and share this information with the future generations, or we will be losing a very big piece of our cultural heritage. Bells share not only the emotions of the bell ringer, but also the community, and that is why I am so concerned about the bells not ringing in the Metropolitan Cathedral, and they have brought down the bells for potential structural issues. But in reality, the bell tower will not fall, especially due to the Mexican construction techniques. People also do not understand that national festivities start and end with a bell. So, will the Metropolitan Cathedral fall? Of course it won't. Is downtown silent enough for the Metropolitan Cathedral to remain standing? Of course not. So, in this sense, the bell would not cause any additional damage. However, it is symbolic that the bells are not there. However, this falls out of the scope of this discussion. So I insist, the symbolic aspects of bells are essential to make the community feel alive. And we're not speaking about bells in very small towns in the middle of the country. No. Mexico City is dying because it has lost its bells, and in fact, next week we are going to talk about this. Architects have overused the solution of bringing down the bells and sending them to the museums, but they have not understood anything about the bells. The bell is the only instrument that not only shares feelings, but that also freezes time. When we listen to Doña María or La Ronca from the Metropolitan Cathedral that are from the 17th century more or less, we are listening to a sound that has been there for more than 4 centuries. When we listen to a bell that was cast in 1820, we are listening to a 400-year-old sound, and still the bells are either recast or just sent to a museum. Of course, I am being very emotional about the bells, and I know that. But this is because this is an essential part of what cultural heritage preservation is. We would need more comprehensive intervention strategies for bells rather than just bringing them down and recasting them or sending them to museums. We need to have an intervention that considers not only the bell but also the ringing of the bell, and to create a specific protocol to recover bells. This is something that we have not done yet, but I wanted to share with you an experience that goes back 6 or 7 years. For example, the Cathedral of Pamplona had not rang its bells for 70 or 80 years, and there were a lot of people that did not know how to ring the bell. However, they have come together to learn how to ring the bells like the ringers did 80 years ago. So the bell is used now as the voice of the community, and that's the focus that we should give to our intervention proposals. So, if this country, which is the largest bell producer in the world, is unable to ring and preserve their bells right, then their efforts will have been in vain, even if they produce 80 to 100 bells per year. So if we have a proper recovery proposal, other companies will see that this is a profitable field. And preservation and proper preservation interventions are more profitable than subsequent recovery. Now let's talk about more technical aspects. There are two types of bells. We have first the bells, and we have the sharings. And a bell is the fixed one. However, we are in Mexico. And in order to solve the issues with the earthquakes, the bells are in an elastic structure. So if this were a bell in Europe, it would be fixed to the wooden beam on top, and the beam would in turn be fixed to the structure. This is not the case in Mexico. We still don't know if the materials that Mexican bells are attached with are of organic origin, or if they are vegetables, or if they are from animal origin, but it doesn't really matter. The point is that the bells here in Mexico are attached to a soft and flexible material. And during earthquakes, we have seen how the bells move even in the opposite direction of the seismic waves. And to a certain extent, and in a way that we don't really know how it works, the bells move opposite to the seismic wave, because otherwise they would break the beam. So this is the traditional Mexican solution, and it's a beautiful solution, in fact. In 2001, 2002, it doesn't really matter, an iron beam was placed, and the traditional solution was implemented. And this is a very bad solution, because iron doesn't collapse the way wooden structures did. And it doesn't give flexibility to the bells. And, well, yes, of course, the wooden beams were fixed, and they were brackets holding these beams, but the point right now is that the opinion of former ringers has not been taken into consideration, and more traditional solutions are being implemented. Another traditional solution is the use of chains. This is not ideal because the chains are harder and they eventually break the support. But since they are made of metal, the low harmonics of the bell are transferred to the metal, and the high harmonics are disseminated in a way that shouldn't, and the sound of the bell is really ugly. And I am sorry to say it, but if the bells were placed for a specific reason 400 years ago, why has the technique changed? The technique has changed because placing a chain takes 6 minutes, as opposed to fixing the bell with a rope. But the thing is that this is not a simplistic task. This is something that's related to our cultural heritage, so we need to invest in it as much time as necessary.
falsa historia que se cuenta en México, y es que las campanas solo duran 20 años y cada 20 años...
There is a piece of fake news in Mexico that says that the bells need to be recast every 20 years because otherwise they won't last. And this is a lie, because if we have bells that have been here since 1560, then it doesn't make sense that bells need to be recast every 20 years. Recasting bells is, of course, of social importance, because when you recast it, and if you are the president of the municipality, or if you are whomever, or if you pay for the bell, well, then you can cast your name into the bell, even if it's for 20 years. So what we should do is to recover the old traditional techniques. And there are people that say, well, something that was used in the 1500s will not last, but is it really true? So, like we said, we have the regular bells and we have the sharings. There are no size limits to sharings. The largest one I know of is in the Cathedral of Guadalajara, and it is 1.8 meters in width, and it is actually in very poor condition. However, Mexico has created solutions for sharings, meaning that sharings will held from cross the knots they were held from a cross structure, as opposed to bells that would be held from 3 points. And this is unique in terms of bell cultural heritage. For example, bells in Europe are held in a star, and what's most important is that if the structure will still hold the bell even if the main beam breaks. This is a bell from San Matías Jalalalco in Oaxaca, and here the main beam broke. However, it had support beams that prevented the bell from falling. So sharings would turn in the case of an earthquake. However, people are terrified of sharings turning on their shaft. However, this is not dangerous, and in fact, I supervised a doctoral thesis about this that proved that the side stress provoked by a sharing that is turning on its shaft is only 10% of the total weight of the bell. So, for example, so if the bell is, for example, 200 kilograms in weight, and it is placed in a 20-ton belfry, then it won't cause any structural damage. And in fact, experts in the past knew this. This is the bell of Tlayacapan, and somehow the walls in the belfry did not move at the same time, and the bell fell because the sharing was not placed with a traditional structure. So, for example, here what we see is the shaft. The shaft is longer than normal, and it is covered. So the bell would not go up and get displaced from the shaft. However, old experts had another solution for this, and even if they were considered stupid by many, then they would use a shaft. And for example, if the shaft breaks and a 200-ton bale falls, if it is connected to the shaft, then it would bring the whole structure down. So what I mean is that old experts or traditional experts placed the bell in a way so that the forces or the stress would be transferred to the support and to the shaft, and sometimes they would also place bearings that would prevent the rest of the structure from cracking. And this served two purposes. First, preventing the bells from falling, of course, but also ensuring that the sound was nice. The best example of this is the bell in the Cathedral of Palma in Mallorca. And the shaft is still long, but the shaft goes into the structure, and it has a channel that the shaft can displace into. And there are other solutions that are impossible in Mexico, because there are shafts that could shrink, but these cannot be implemented in Mexico. But the Mexican solutions enable the bells to turn on the shaft. However, since our cultural heritage doesn't make sense except in the context of a society and the context of crazy old people like me, and if we only think about our cultural heritage as something that attracts tourists, then we don't really get into something such as this. However, cultural heritage should in fact give a sense of purpose to the community. The problem right now is that bells should not be electric. The interpreter apologizes. There are technical difficulties in the booth and sound is not coming in. Once again, the interpreter apologizes. Sound is not coming in. Yet again, an apology from the interpreter's booth. The sound is not coming in. The interpreter apologizes. Sound is still not coming in. An apology from the interpreter's booth. A lot of people think that progress is just the fact that you can push a button and then a bell rings, but this is not progress. That is why, a while ago, I was recommending that we should use or have a bell recovery protocol that is based on traditional methods. In fact, this is something that I proposed in Valencia. We intervened a series of old bells in the town of Teste, and there were some bells that had wooden structures, and some of them didn't have the shafts that I have just mentioned.
Hizo un nuevo paradigma de restauración, es decir, si los toques de campanas locales varían de un sitio a otro, tiene que ser una instalación que permita el toque local y no otro.
And what we based our intervention in was on the fact that the bells should ring differently from one community to another because they are a distinctive community feature. This is something that we need to implement in Mexico. I'm not really sure how, but what we need is to create a bell recovery model that protects all bells and not only the bell of Dolores. That is a cultural reference for Mexicans. However, an inventory and a specific bell intervention proposal is not yet in our radar. And in fact, nobody has one, not even European countries. Many European countries will often say that they have a specific protocol to recover bells, but that is not true. A record of this sort would enable us to identify where the most important bells are and to share information about this cultural heritage. This has also been very useful in the case of stolen bells. For example, in 1727, the Joseph and Mary bells were stolen and we didn't know what happened to them. However, if we had had a record about those bells, we would have been able to track them down and reinstall them in their original churches. So in some, bells are not meant for museums. They are not meant to be brought down and be recast. They are an expression of a sense of community. So when we intervene a belfry, we should think about the belfry not only as an architectural element, which it is, but the bell itself is, and the tower itself is a musical instrument. I hope this is useful for you, and this is always useful for me to continue reflecting upon this issue. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Dr. Lop. So before opening our Q&A session, I would like to say that your participation and your help has been extremely enriching. At the National Institute of Anthropology, we realized two things thanks to your help. First of all, on having a bell record, and second, the importance of bringing together both the restorers and the architects. As part of our efforts, we are going to have a course on bell records. We are going to have it next week. And this course will be highly relevant because currently the Institute is putting a lot of effort into its records and its inventories. And we found that we had kept the records of many historical sites and assets, but we had not given bells their due importance. So what we are going to do during this course is to work on our registration method, and we are also going to look for a way to upload that onto our electronic system. So are there any questions? You're very shy today. Thank you, María Carmen. Like Talia said, thank you very much, Dr. Lop. And I would like to highlight the social work involved in the recovery of a bell. It is true that you can tell what community you are arriving at thanks to the sound of their bells, and this happened to us in the community of Huapichula. In this community, they have a church that has a belfry that has been there for 200 years, and the community's inhabitants cannot even think of the community without their belfry and the sound of their bell. So thank you very much for this comment about their importance. If there aren't any additional questions, let's give a round of applause to Dr. Lopez. Speaking of Huaquechula, there was a discussion session in Huaquechula, and the thing that was very important was that the sacristan died and nobody knew how to inform the rest of the community about the disease, or rather the death of the sacristan of Huaquechula, and they had to announce that through loudspeakers. And this is a very good example of how a cultural practice is lost. Yes, this case is very in point, and so it is also important to consider that when we talk about records, it's not only a record about the object itself, but about how it is used. And I will tell you an anecdote of my youth. And we videotaped the use of 500 bells, and 40 years later, people have relearned how to ring the bell thanks to these videotapes. So it's not only a matter of safeguarding the bell, but also having people play or ring the bell like it has always been done. And this information should also be shared with the future generations. This is very important because, for example, my wife and I, back in the days during that project, we realized that everyone knew how to ring the bell, but they didn't really know how to ring the bell to its full extent. So it's not only a matter of preserving the structure and the object itself, but also preserving the fragile, intangible asset of knowing how to ring the bell. And for example, I will always give or tell about the case of how the bell in my community of origin in Aragon announces the death of someone the same way a church in Zaragoza announces a festivity or a celebration. And it is very interesting to see how different communities use the sound of the bell for different purpose. However, without if the sound and the ringing of the bell is not put in context, it is really meaningless. So recovering bells and bell records should not only be a series of photographs about how the bell looks when it is in the belfry. We should also record how it is rung, and how it sounds. And for other architectural items, you can just go and measure them. However, for a bell, in order to record how the bell is used, you need to go up to the bell and ring it. And it is the most sacred item of any church. And the same goes for every church, regardless of which one you are talking about. We have a last question on this side.
¿Ahora? No, no es una pregunta, es simplemente...
This is not a question. This is a comment. Building on what you said about the structural damage to belfries, the only structural damage that I have seen being caused by bells has been the structural damage caused when people want to install the bell, not when the bell collapses. And for example, people have opened up holes to put up bigger bells, and if they didn't know how to raise it, they damaged the building. I think that on top of this, the problem is lack of maintenance. For example, all the ringers knew how to take care of their belfry and the bell, and if they were hungry, they would eat the doves. And the doves right now are a plague in most belfries, and this degrades the bells and the belfries. Maintenance is not something that comes out of the blue. And yesterday we were talking about how maintenance was given every 51st year. This would happen in my church in Valencia, and you would be punished if you gave maintenance at any other time. And you could even be excommunicated for this. There's another question, but please make it short.
Yo nada más quería saber si hay algún estudio justo de la relación entre la altura que
I only want to know if there is a study that shows the relationship between the height of the belfry and the size of the bell, because like you said, the belfry is the resonance box, or the sounding board of the whole instrument as such. And of course there is information about the bells, but not about the belfry as a whole. That is what records are for. Records should not only describe the size of the belfry as well as the bell, but also how the sound reverberates inside. This will only be available with proper records. Normally, what people will do is to bring down the fake wall, and because they think it is useless. However, it does have a function in this whole sounding board. A round of applause, please, for Dr. Locke. And we would like to call Dr. Lourdes Esteves as well as Renato. Renato will help us with interpretation. Right now we are going to have Portuguese into Spanish translation. However, I think that your presentation is in Spanish, so most Spanish speakers will be able to understand the presentation. If you don't speak Spanish, please ask for a translation receiver at the front of the auditorium while we display the presentation. Thank you.
No. Nada más la va a estar apoyando si se atora en algo.
Esteves is an expert technician from the Antonio Arroyo School in Lisbon. She received a degree from the Restoration Institute, and she's also part of the Politécnica Institute. She has recently became a doctor from the Lisbon Institute. Her thesis called Historical Portuguese Mosaic received honors. Since 1991, she has been in charge of the Preservation and Restoration Division as part of the Lisbon National Museum. She also does official buildings supervision, consultancy, and she collaborates with several institutions, schools, and universities across the country. I'd like to thank Renata Schneider. She's a restorer, and she has supported us in this presentation. Thank you, Lourdes. Thank you. I wanted to thank you for the invitation to this symposium. I'd like to thank the Ministry of Culture, the National Heritage Commission, the European Union delegation to Mexico, and Renata Schneider.
Y a todos los presentes en la sala.
México é muito rico em pintura mural. Portugal é muito rico em azulejos. Todo o interior dos monumentos está revestido.
All the interior of the monuments are comprised by tiles, and it may be done in roofs.
Caracteriza es la riqueza en azulejos que puede estar en lambrines, en cubiertas, en todos los interiores y puede estar incluso en los techos.
Portugal teve 2 grandes terremotos que estão registados. Em
Portugal suffered 2 earthquakes, one in 1531, where 30,000 people passed away. It destroyed Lisbon and its surroundings.
El primero fuerte fue el 26 de enero de 1531 y se calcula que se murieron cerca de 30,000 personas y destruyó Lisboa y varias ciudades aledañas, como Santarém.
Sí. 2 séculos depois,
2 centuries afterwards, since November 1755, there was another large earthquake.
En 1955 hubo un segundo terremoto que fue uno de los terremotos como más destructivos y mortales de la historia, por lo menos en Europa, causando la muerte de cientos de personas.
Sí, porque o epicentro do terremoto
the epicenter of the earthquake happened in Lisbon and its surroundings. After the earthquake, the city was destroyed by the earthquake and by the fire. Due to the fire waves, many buildings collapsed, and it even affected Spain, that's next to Portugal, and Morocco. Near 85% of buildings were destroyed, including palaces, churches, and many other spaces of heritage value. This was noticed in many countries, and they did several paintings, engravings, in order to represent the destruction of the city. There is a great panel that's called Lisbon's Greatest Landscape, where the city is represented with all of the monuments, houses, everything painted in tiles. And this is important since through this painting, made in the 18th century,
hoje em dia conseguimos
Bearing
saber
in mind which
quais
are
é que
the buildings
desapareceram
and
e quais os que ficaram.
assets, we now are able to know which ones disappeared and
Há aqui uma
collapsed and
parte
which ones
importante que
didn't.
é Lisboa,
Now,
neste
this is
momento,
a very important
está
part.
muito rico
Lisbon is currently
intervenções a nível de imóveis, porque o
a
turismo
city
cresceu,
filled with interventions
muitas
to
obras
assets
de remodelação
given
e
to
de qualificação
tourism.
aos
Many
edifícios antigos. Com isso há
buildings
escavações
are
arqueológicas
under
e são estas escavações
refurbishment,
arqueológicas que hoje em dia nos
and
transmitem
there are
e nos
also
dizem
archaeological
o que se usava na época, isto é, quais eram as
excavations
instalações no século XVI,
that tell us
quais
what
eram
was
as decorações no
used
século XVIII.
at that
Isto
time,
como consequência de
including which were the structures used in the 16th and throughout the 18th century. All of these was a consequence of the earthquake. We are now able to write stories. The tile story. Tile is very renowned in Portugal and as well as in other countries, and as an archaeological excavation we're able to find new patterns as well as new artisan models. These image shows tiles with burnt glass, and this is the aspect they have under such circumstances. In Portugal, we are all waiting and we're ready for the third earthquake. Since it happens every 2 centuries, we are now reaching the end of the 2nd century, and there are many news related to it. We need to be careful. We are aware that the next earthquake is about to get to Portugal, but in reality, Portugal is not ready to face these events. Most of our buildings in tiles that are in the facades, they are placed but misplaced due to mistaken interventions. For instance, due to this, there are plants growing on the top of the roof. And now, tile is a very complex material since it is comprised by a porous bracket, which is mud that is cooked, and there are also other parts that are decorative as well as the water-resistant parts. If there is an issue with water, then water moves onto clay and the glass ends up forming a barrier so that water goes upwards. Now, tile production process is very important since it will represent how will it degrade. To the left, there is a 17th century tile, and there are 2 types of mods, a red and a beige, and it's marbled. And to the right is the result of these materials' degradation. It may lose all the decorations. Now, in older times, they used to work with their feet, and that's how they used mud. They didn't want a damaged clay due to the feet use. However, we were still able to notice many tiles with some stones and impurities within. Now, the glass that you see to your left, the glaze collapses. In the upper right corner, you're able to see the degradation status of this panel that is outside. Tiles degrade due to salt. In fact, in Portugal, we even found salt presence in tiles, and we also found glazing faults, cracks in glazes, and there are two glazing losses. One is at the corners, which is the image on the bottom, and losses in the edges. From there, water will evaporate and salt will appear. This is an example. It's the same set, it's the same area. One happened in 2007 and the other one 6 years afterwards. As you're able to see, salt degradation is very large, and this is how we lose it. There are other highly complex cases. This is a hermitage next to a coastal area next to the sea, and there is a lot of salt up in the air. The interior includes tiles. Everything is tiled up. The ceiling, the walls. And there is a picture from 1970, and in this image there is no degradation, meaning that tiles had been placed 250 years earlier without being damaged. And even if we're next to the sea, there is salt, but in this case there were no damages. In 2012, when we conducted a second inspection, I, as well as everyone else, we noticed that degradation was evident, very active, and at the same time frightening. Anyone that's within this hermitage is able to listen the sound, the cracking sound of these glazes and tiles. And this happens in 250 years. And it's all due to the earthquake. In here we're able to see degradation shapes, the loss of our glazing. It is a very aggressive glazing loss. Aggressive and deep. In this case, glaze falls away, mud, and there is no intervention. Fragments they fall. I analyzed in several parts of the country, and I noticed that there are different salts linked to damages in tiles. And in here we can notice that the type of salt will change the degradation process behind the tile. This is a magnesium that crystallizes within mud. Now, it's important to find the morphology of a 17th century Portuguese tile, and in here we can see mud, and in this electronic microscopy we're able to see impurity. The shape in which mud and glazing is placed is very important, since it will represent degradation. You're able to see that there is a link between glazing and mud, There's also another shape where the interface highlights glazing. And as part of my PhD studies, I placed several tiles from different times. I conducted trials for a year and a half, and we noticed that when we have a fragile tile, if there are crackings, it cannot resist and it'll lose the whole glazing. Water will expand, and it seems as if the tile is cracked due to the water. The conclusion reached is that if there were no water, then there wouldn't be degradation. The issue lies then in water. If the building is in good conditions without humidity, then there are no issues. But in this room, there are salt issues. However, there is a groundwater. Because of it, we needed to seek another solution. We need to include the acid in our intervention. In here we included a new system. All of these tiles were intervened, and we placed them in the air lamp, which is used in aviation. We created an air box, and through masonry we created tiles, and by using traditional materials we placed tiles on the walls. We place them just as it traditionally is done, through mortar uses. We also had glazed structures, and we noticed degradation. Therefore, the same solution was implemented. In this way, salts don't reach the ceramic, water does not reach it either. And now I'd like to introduce some degradation cases, or rather intervention. The National Tile Museum addresses restoration differently. Our intention is reconstituting areas that are missing, since that's the only way in which people will be able to enjoy these structures. Now, there's also the possibility of non-reconstructing and leaving these areas as they are. We can also conduct several interventions. This is a very complex site. Areas that lost panels, they were reconstructed with tiles without glazing. But in these cases, visitors noticed that there was a structure, and we decided to leave the glazing damages. We left them as degradation signals and its evaluation. Now, in here, people are only able to see mud and these holes, and it becomes complex. We noticed several interventions. For instance, next to it are these tiles and intervened tiles where faces are reconstructed, and on the bottom was a reconstruction by means of new tiles. Now, this is the rebuild of a missing part. We used clay for this piece, and what we want is for it to represent the missing piece, and it's baked. Now, whenever there are direction elements, there are several ways to intervene. If it is a standard, we are able to rebuild. The only thing that we need to do is to copy it, and we rebuild glazing, colors as close as possible to the original. We look at the registry, what piece is missing, and from it we're able to know what is the restoration. If there's ever a need to change it, we're able to identify it. And here we are also able to see that this is an existing unit, and we're able to understand this pattern. This is how we reconstruct images. This starts from, well, part of this information was missing, but below it we're able to see an identical tile. We reconstructed it, we used ceramics, we painted it as we should, and this piece then is placed back into the original tile. On the top you're able to see glazing. It has some spots, and on the bottom we see the glazing and some pigment. It was still raw, and afterwards we see the baked pieces, baked in glazed pieces. Sometimes we have a hard time reading. We know what it is in general terms, but we work in identifying the image. We're trying to understand the piece, its unity, and here is the reconstructed panel, community as work. Now, recovering units. When there are engravings, we're able to reconstruct missing pieces, as was done by the artist. This is the final outcome with engraving, the color, and the glazing. Here are some other cases with many missing parts. This is a more complex design, and we were able to rebuild this image. In the 18th century, when Portuguese were painters, they were true artists. They didn't stick to drawings, rather they transformed them. This is a Neptune that has whose face is looking towards a side, and the painter decided to place the face to the opposite direction. This is a highly difficult reading for this panel. So what do we do? Do we leave it as is? No. In this case, we reconstructed it. The frame was the most difficult part, since there were no orientation or direction elements. So by focusing on the image, the people notice the main image at the core, and our intervention does not affect it. Now, in this case, we didn't know which were the figures. There was no record of this piece. Therefore, we left this wheel without placing anything in fill. This is a very complex case. We didn't have any direction elements nor additional information, but we couldn't leave our tiles in blank. These missing pieces couldn't remain blank or white, and we decided to provide continuity to the design by making use of other designs around it, and we did leave some pieces in white. Now you're able to see it in our restoration intervention. And the most important part of it is that what you notice is the whole of this work and not just the intervention pieces. This was an exhibit with Flanders tiles from the 15th and 16th century. It was requested to Portugal, and we only had less than 70% of our tiles. We cleaned them up, looked for their numbers, the ones that they tell us, the position that a tile has within a panel, and we intended to include decoration, to place decoration. This is part of tile 33 from the second panel. All tiles of the second panel were placed separately, and afterwards we counted them and placed them as in a puzzle. Now, how can this ruin suggest the creation of a panel? We mounted it by means of drawings, and there are white areas that imply missing parts. In here you're able to see all the tiles that were placed in their position. It is still a ruin, it's a wreck, but these are important tiles and they deserve to be displayed. If you see on the bottom, you'll notice the scheme in black of what the panel looked like. So from the bits and pieces that we had, we were able to notice their position, and this is the same case. It's actually the same. This was a different location, and it was easier to have the design on the bottom. It was printed and tiles were placed on top of the design. So it was easier than the first solution I presented you with. This is a tile ruin, but what would it be like? This is what it'd be like, and we allow people to analyze, see, observe, and study what this panel would correspond to. The last image was of our exhibit, and now I'd like to thank you for your assistance.
Muchas gracias, Lourdes.
We thank Lourdes, and we will now open up the floor for some Q&A. Now, Renata, I'll ask you to please translate so the questions are clear. Now, are there any questions? Over here, Roberto. Good afternoon. Just one question. What was the material used? And what is the material used now? The material was prepared with sand from different types of grains so that lime and sand would stick. It's called aerolam.
Lo colocan y luego utilizan arenas de diferentes granulometrías y van haciendo, digamos, como unos terciados con el mortero hasta que lo pueden colocar como se hacía originalmente. Pero lo van terciando para que pueda ir, digamos, vaya adhiriendo mejor en la primera parte y luego vaya respirando hasta que lo colocan.
Atualmente, esta foi a nossa solução que nos pareceu a mais correta. O grande problema é que atualmente usa-se muitas argamassas de cimento, que são mais práticas.
The issue is that some cement mortars, since they are faster to be placed, but they have a different heavy degree, and they bring with it salts. So current interventions with cement mortars, they are using it even though they believe the traditional mortar is not useful. So the main issue they have in Portugal is that brickers, the one that actually place tilers, they use cement. And cement brings with it salts and heavy characteristics, so they are now generating protocols so that traditional techniques are used, similar to the Mexicans that are lime and sand. Valeria and then María Carmen. Excuse me, María Carmen. Lourdes, thank you. Is the reintegration criteria different when tiles are on site on these buildings? Or does it change if they are in a museum? And if it's different, what is that difference? It is not different. Yesterday we were working in field and a work came to mind. Perhaps one day I'll be able to share it with you, but this work included the community, and there are several tile panels, and in the backdrop they are teaching religion to those that are part of that mass. Tiles are missing since this church was really damaged by the earthquake, and now our task is counting them since we cannot leave spaces empty. The community doesn't understand. They want a restored church, but also complete panels. In restoration terms, this is extremely complex. We are able to reconstruct by means of our data. We try to reconstruct based on ceramics. That is the best way to reconstruct panels on site. It is the same material, clay, and if clay is good enough, it will resist even more than a cold work intervention. In some others, other type of materials are used and they don't stick as well as the other ones.
La visita se dio cuenta que le faltaba haber mostrado un caso que está trabajando actualmente, que se está trabajando con una comunidad, que son una serie de paneles figurativos que se hicieron un poco para catequizar, no para catequizar, pero para reforzar, bueno, no es México, no evangelizaban, pero para reforzar la religión católica, y que tienen que volver a hacer en su totalidad, porque si no la gente no entiende el mensaje que tienen los paneles. Entonces lo están trabajando exactamente igual que en el museo, pero están haciendo las restauraciones en lo que ellos le llaman en caliente, es decir, que hacen la reproducción directa desde la cerámica para que no tengan problemas de sales y otros problemas in situ, ¿no? Ese es básicamente
La pregunta que a mí me interesaba, y justo por eso incluimos en este programa
we included as part of this program mosaics, because just as it happens in murals, some walls were cracked in the earthquake, and when that happens you need to have joint decision making with the architect in order to fix that crack. Now, in the cases of domes that did not collapse, but that include mosaics, in order to fix cracks, we have held meetings with architects, and it's in some cases, in order to save mosaics, we need to uphold them. So just as is the case in mural paintings, they may come off the wall. Is there any established methodology for these type of cases where you're actually able to recover mosaic through this process? It's the same. If there is a crack originated from the structure's movement or due to an earthquake, then these areas are taken from that part. All tiles are withdrawn, they are treated or intervened and then replaced afterwards. And if we don't have enough tiles to place them in the missing parts, we reproduce them and replace them again.
Lejos, se arregla la falla arquitectónica y se recolocan los que se pueden recolocar. Los que no se pueden recolocar se vuelven a mandar a hacer. Básicamente lo mismo que hacemos nosotros, nada más que en Portugal es más complicado porque son figurativos muchos. Acá en general es patrón, entonces no tenemos ese problema. No sé si querías la explicación técnica de cómo los levantan también.
Explicação técnica? Sim. Como é que levantamos os azulejos? Utilizamos pela forma manual, utilizamos ou espátula
And how do we
ou escopo e maceta.
take tiles from the wall? We use a hammer
Massa e os azulejos são
and a spatula, and we scrape it, and we use mortar. So we open joints, not to take the glazing off, and by means of the spatula and the hammer, as well as the mortar, they separate it from the structure. And she didn't say so, but in Portugal I also noticed it, that tiles from the 19th and 20th century are made from other materials that are not precisely ceramic. So it's easy to scratch them off. But they don't veil them in order to have a full vision of this tile.
Italian or English, what do you prefer?
English or Italian? Italian? Ok. Lei ha fatto vedere diversi casi in cui viene fatta una reintegrazione totale dal punto di vista estetico. Come approcciate nel restauro e nella conservazione, soprattutto nella reintegrazione delle lacune, il problema del falso storico?
Havendo registro do estado do painel,
If there's a record of the panel state of its refurbishment, then placing new tiles are units. They are units that may be removed at any point in time. But for us, our aim is leaving the work as a whole piece for you to see it and understand these work instead of damaging the work in the intervention. If there is a record, then it is part of our restoration process. I am not altering the original one, rather helping people to get to see this piece and understand its meaning.
Dell'immagine dell'insieme, se ho capito correttamente la risposta.
Agora não entendi.
Che comunque ci sono diverse tecniche con cui si può distinguere pur ridando l'immagine dell'intero.
Sim, é possível distinguir.
A criare un falso che è difficile da distinguere.
Sim, o restauro a quente é possível de se perceber. Porquê? porque a superfície vidrada é mais lisa, é mais brilhante.
We can see where it is in the restoration process. This surface is, the glazing is shinier,
Quem for só observador que está de passagem,
and
mas para o entendido,
people that are familiar with restoration are the only ones that will notice. Viewers, common viewers, will not notice, but for an expert, a technical expert, he or she will notice where are these restored pieces, but we are not making entirely fake pieces.
Le queremos agradecer mucho a Lourdes con un aplauso.
We'd like to thank Lourdes.
Bueno, y comentarles también a todos que Lourdes accedió.
We'd like to
también a
thank
quedarse, prácticamente
Thank you.
una semana
Lourdes
más.
agreed in staying a whole week. And us restorers, we are really interested in updating. And she'll be part of a workshop in coordination, included in the coordination. Now, if you want, we'll have a short coffee break, and we'll be back at 1. The next conferences will be in Italian, so if you want interpretation, please ask for a